Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 1 November 2025. 270 years ago today, on Saturday, 1 November 1755, a terrible earthquake struck Lisbon. The earthquake was followed by a tsunami, as is often the case with coastal earthquakes, since the same subterranean movements that generate the earthquake also generate a tsunami. It's not uncommon that the tsunami following an earthquake does more damage than the earthquake itself. It's likely that the Sumatra Andaman earthquake of 26 December 2004 was the worst natural disaster that has occurred or will occur in my lifetime in terms of total casualties, with almost 250,000 dead. And most of these were the result of the tsunami following an earthquake. At Lisbon, the destruction of the buildings by the earthquake and the tsunami was followed by fires. Since November 1st is All Saints' Day, many candles were lighted, and the earthquake knocked over the candles, and that started fires. Lisbon was effectively laid waste by the combined actions of earthquake, flood, and fire, with about 85% of the city being destroyed. As many as 40,000 people may have been killed in Lisbon, and there were many other smaller towns along the coast where thousands more were killed. There's an interesting book about this and the subsequent rebuilding of Lisbon that I recommend, The Last Day, Wrath, Ruin, and Reason in the Great Lisbon Earthquake in 1755 by Nicholas Schrady. Schrady's theme in his book is the divergence between the naturalistic and non-naturalistic explanations for the earthquake and its consequences. Inevitably, after the disaster, the wickedness of the people of Lisbon was blamed for this especially destructive event. Gabriel Malagrida, in a 1756 pamphlet titled An Opinion on the True Causes of the Earthquake, argued that the disaster in Lisbon was divine retribution for the sins of the people of Lisbon. Quote, "Learn, O Lisbon, that the destroyers of our houses, palaces, churches, and convents, the cause of the death of so many people, and of the flames that devoured such vast treasures, are your abominable sins, and not comets, stars, vapors, and exhalations, and similar natural phenomena. Tragic Lisbon is now a mound of ruins. Would that it were less difficult to think of some method of restoring the place, but it has been abandoned, and the refugees from the city live in despair. As for the dead, what a harvest of sinful souls such disasters send to hell." Unquote. Despite condemnations of the sinfulness of the people of Lisbon, the currents of the Enlightenment were already strong in 1755, and the traditional non-naturalistic accounts of the destruction of Lisbon had to contend with contemporary naturalistic explanations of the destruction of Lisbon, which didn't involve imputing any especially heinous sins to the people of the city. Voltaire wrote a long philosophical poem about the Lisbon earthquake, which responded to many of the claims made and offered a different interpretation of the event. His poem starts like this in the William F. Fleming translation. Quote, "O wretched man, earth fated to be cursed, abyss of plagues and miseries the worst, horrors on horrors, griefs on griefs must show that man's the victim of unceasing woe, and lamentations which inspire my strain prove that philosophy is false and vain." Unquote. Voltaire also mentions the Lisbon earthquake in his Candide, but while Candide is effectively a humorous romp through human misfortune and misery, and if you're wondering how that's possible, read the book, Voltaire's poem about the Lisbon earthquake is much darker. For many people at the time, the Lisbon earthquake forced the problem of evil out into the open and into sudden prominence. The death of so many and the destruction of the city seemed to call for an explanation, and many explanations drew on arguments that had been developed over centuries in the discussion of the problem of evil. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states the problem of evil in these terms, the opening sentence of their article on it. Quote, the epistemic question posed by evil is whether the world contains undesirable states of affairs that provide the basis for an argument that makes it unreasonable to believe in the existence of God, unquote. It would be easy to assume that the problem of evil begins and ends with monotheistic religion, but the problem is an ancient one, given one of its earliest classic formulations, probably by Epicurus, though it may have been someone else. The historical record isn't quite clear, but Epicurus's formulation was something like this. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able to? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then comes evil? Because we don't have an exact quote from Epicurus, there are a lot of different wordings of this paradox, and they all make essentially the same point. However, the point can be taken or received in rather different ways. And I have a personal example of what I mean when I say that the problem of evil can be taken in different ways. The first time I ever gave a presentation at a conference, the title of my presentation was The Moral Imperative of Human Space Exploration, and in it, I discussed a number of evils that beset human civilization. But I've never personally given much thought to the problem of evil, since there's no way to formulate the problem of evil within a consistently naturalistic framework. So I was quite surprised when, after my talk, someone said to me that I had been discussing the problem of evil in it. It had honestly never occurred to me that someone might take what I said as a commentary on the problem of evil, so I never mentioned it. But I can imagine after the fact that for someone interpreting what I was saying in terms of the problem of evil, it might have sounded dishonest on my part to have talked about this classic problem without explicitly having identified it as such. And the idea of the problem of evil, which seems to be interpreted so loosely it can mean any discussion of human suffering, is still very much with us in the present day. A contemporary example can be found in Bart D. Ehrman's book, God's Problem, How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. Ehrman is a scholar of early Christianity, and by his own account, someone who started out as a sincerely and devoutly believing Christian, only to find that he had lost his faith after many years of study and confronting the problem of suffering. Ehrman writes, quote, over the years, I've talked with a lot of people about issues pertaining to suffering, and I am struck by the kind of reactions I get, unquote. After briefly discussing avoidance of the issue of suffering altogether, and those responses to the problem of suffering that he considers to be answers that are too pat to be satisfying, Ehrman moves on to a third category of responses to suffering that he cannot accept. Quote, other people, including some of my brilliant friends, realize why it's a religious problem for me, but don't see it as a problem for themselves. In its most nuanced form, this view is that religious faith is not an intellectualizing system for explaining everything. Faith is a mystery and an experience of the divine in the world, not a solution to a set of problems, unquote. In Ehrman's formulation of this view, that he can't accept, there's an echo of the famous passage from David Hume and his essay on miracles. Hume wrote, quote, we may conclude that the Christian religion not only was at first attended with miracles, but even at this present day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. Mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity, and whoever is moved by faith to assent it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience, unquote. This passage from Hume has become a standard point of reference, not only for those who followed Hume and formulated the naturalistic conception of the world that dominates our thinking today, since Hume is one of the sources of the empiricism in philosophy that eventually became contemporary scientific naturalism. But Hume also was a reference point for Phidias, who see in this argument the last remaining legitimate form of an uncompromising expression of faith. Faith is a miracle, therefore proof in itself of what faith wants to believe. Ehrman writes that he respects this view and sometimes wishes that he could share it, but ultimately he cannot. He writes, quote, "The God that I once believed in was a God who was active in this world," unquote. He makes it clear that his confrontation with suffering was crucial to his loss of faith, and he further makes explicit that his remarks about his faith were all in the past tense, so there's no question of an equivocation in his belief. He's not about to say that he will change his mind if only someone can show him an intellectually legitimate way to formulate the problem of human suffering. I cite Ehrman because he's able to give eloquent expression to something that is sharply and poignantly felt by many who don't have the means to express themselves as well as he does. So he's representative of many today who can't accept a naturalistic account of human suffering because it doesn't answer their deepest needs and longing to do justice to a noble and honorable conception of man, but a conception that's rooted in a non-naturalistic conception of history. Human suffering appears as a cosmic grievance, and a cosmic grievance can only be addressed by a cosmic remedy. Without the cosmic remedy, the human suffering of the cosmic grievance goes unaddressed. In a naturalistic framework, it seems nearly impossible to even do justice to the question because naturalism doesn't find cosmic meaning in suffering and destruction. Already at the time of the Lisbon earthquake, there were completely naturalistic accounts given of the disaster, but even though a naturalistic conception of natural disasters was already possible given the state of scientific knowledge in 1755, this wasn't the common response. And I think we could say it certainly wasn't the instinctive response. If a disaster of great magnitude occurs today, it's usually described in naturalistic terms, but there remains a sizable minority of people who understand such things non-naturalistically and who are determined to find human meaning in naturalistic events. Evolutionary psychologists would say that the human agency detector would insist on finding some non-human agency behind the earthquake. So what's the naturalistic account of human suffering that is felt to be inadequate and which doesn't address the cosmic dimension of human suffering? The naturalistic understanding of great natural disasters recognizes that a cataclysm can befall human beings and all their works, and the event has no meaning at all. We can even increase the scale of the disaster to the level of an existential risk and assert that an event of such great magnitude that would annihilate our species, and naturalistically understood, even an event of this magnitude would have no intrinsic meaning. Of course, I realize that even to say that a disaster that produces great human suffering is without meaning sounds inhumane. This is an idea that many apparently rational and intelligent people find incoherent, though in other parts of their lives where great suffering is not at issue, they will tacitly accept the absence of intrinsic meaning in natural events. So it's almost as if there's a threshold, and when an event exceeds that threshold, it's believed to possess a meaning that trivial events don't possess. Of course, a great disaster is given human meaning by the stories that emerge from the lived experience of the disaster, if anyone survives it, as they did at Lisbon. But this is importantly distinct from an event having an intrinsic meaning apart from the meaning given to it ex post facto by human beings who experienced it. But for a great event to be given meaning by human beings after the fact flies in the face of our unstated presupposition that great events have great meanings of their own. That is to say, that they possess intrinsic meaning, and it is for human beings to make sense of that meaning, making the world a kind of puzzle that's ours to try to solve. I don't myself accept this caricature of the naturalistic understanding of natural disasters as I've just stated it, because I think there are senses in which natural events have intrinsic meanings, but a full exposition of this idea will have to wait for another time, although I have touched on it in several previous episodes. Suffice it to say for the moment that natural meanings are the condition of the possibility of human meanings, which come later in history in a naturalistic account. Human meanings build on, elaborate, refine, and extend natural meanings. And we do this because we are a part of nature, not something standing outside nature. The traditional conception of the problem of evil has as an unstated presupposition that human beings are outside nature, and therefore our suffering demands an explanation that's also outside nature. I reject this presupposition because I think that a naturalistic conception of history places human beings within natural history, and this is where I often find myself thinking against the grain of so much philosophy of history, which begins with a distinction between natural history and human history, and this is as much as to say that human history stands outside nature. It may well be the case that human beings don't yet possess an adequate conceptual infrastructure and sufficient historical experience to be able to understand great natural disasters naturalistically. In Voltaire's poem that I quoted earlier, he wrote that events like Lisbon, quote, prove that philosophy is false and vain, unquote. Voltaire had in mind theological explanations and elaborate philosophical theodicies like that of Leibniz, but we see it seems to be just as true of contemporary naturalistic thought. Because of our limited conceptual infrastructure and limited historical experience, in times of great duress, we are thrown back on the non-naturalistic conceptions that so dominated earlier forms of human civilization. While our present technological civilization, predicated as it is upon a relentless pursuit of methodological naturalism, has far outstripped most of the institutions of nomadic and agricultural society, we don't yet possess the intellectual institutions commensurate with the forces that have been unleashed by civilization. This is a variation on the familiar theme that our technological development has outstripped our moral development. And this is a theme that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I've been hoping to find a way to talk about it in a comprehensive framework. I'm not yet ready to discuss this in the comprehensive way I have in mind, so I'm going to save that for a later date. But we can make a start in the direction of a conceptual infrastructure adequate to the exposition of natural and man-made cataclysms by adapting the idea of the terror of history to natural history. I discussed the terror of history in my episode on Mircea Eliade, who introduced the phrase in his book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, Cosmos and History. Natural disasters represent for us the terror of natural history, and human beings have been suffering from natural disasters for far longer than we've experienced the anthropogenic terrors produced by civilization. Pre-modern conceptions of cyclical history were, for Eliade, a refuge from the terrors of history, and our delivery into linear history has left us naked before the depredations of time, and we thus experience the full force of the terror of history without any coping strategy to help us. A naturalistic conception of history entails that human beings were biological beings long before we were civilized beings, and we've been prey to the sufferings of biological beings for the entirety of our existence as a species. Human history has added to these natural biological woes with its terrors of war, disease, failed harvest, famine, riots, and cruel tyrants. In a naturalistic context, it's important to observe that these disasters, and most particularly famine and disease, are in equal measures human and natural disasters. That is to say, they are naturally occurring events that are exacerbated by human history since the advent of civilization. So any distinction that one draws between the two is merely conventional. Given that natural history emerged incrementally from the natural history with which it is, I should say, given that human history emerged incrementally from the natural history with which it is continuous, it retains the possibility of suffering from our pre-civilized condition and adds new forms of suffering distinctive to human history. These distinctive forms of suffering from human history were traditionally personified as the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, disease, famine, and death, the familiar terrors of history. But as I observed, these forms of suffering are often equal parts natural and distinctively human. And this was true of the Lisbon earthquake as well. Earthquakes have been a part of the natural history of Earth since the geological forces of plate tectonics took shape, and human beings have never known a history without earthquakes. However, building a city in a geologically active location on the coast, exposed also to tsunami risk, and lighting the city with candles compounds the human suffering caused by earthquakes. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived through earthquakes, floods, and fires with only minimal casualties. Bands of hunter-gatherer nomads are usually small, usually fewer than 150 persons. They don't stay in any one place for long. They don't build infrastructure, and they don't have many possessions to lose. All of these things came later with civilizations. We build the institutions and the infrastructure of our civilization to protect ourselves from the terror of history, but the unintended consequence was to create new terrors of history for which human beings then attempted to construct new coping mechanisms. This process can be iterated for as long as we or our descendants can build new forms of life on our existing biology or upon any future biology yet to evolve, since any new form of life may result in the unintended consequence of a new form of suffering. And these new forms of suffering are likely to inspire novel conceptions of their meaning and import retroactively projected onto human history, and thus they will place the problem of evil in a new light. I said that the Lisbon earthquake was understood at the time as an event forcing the problem of evil out into the open. But I think we can better understand the interpretation of the Lisbon earthquake as a conflict among conceptions of history. We can take as basic the distinction between naturalistic and non-naturalistic conceptions of history. There are many forms of naturalism and many forms of supernaturalism, and some of these cross over each other. For example, there are both fatalistic forms of naturalism and non-naturalism, according to which human beings can do nothing to prevent the evils from which we must suffer. But there are also forms of naturalism and non-naturalism that emphasize human agency and our ability to, if not prevent disasters, at least to better recover from them, and so suffer less from them the next time around. Lisbon was rebuilt on a new plan that incorporated some of the first building technologies intended to reduce future risks from earthquakes, which is a practical demonstration of human agency in the face of natural disasters and a quintessentially naturalistic response to suffering. And that maybe can give us another perspective on the problem of evil, if not dispel it. Thanks for listening.